there's a kind of magic which we all participate in unknowingly, and that is that having imagined a thing, we can make it happen. Imagination is a kind of a trigger. For example, an engineer may imagine all the details of a sports car, and then he can actually make the sports car. Or the computer man, the computer engineer, works out the software, and then it is, well, that's the main work. Making it into hardware, that's a secondary thing. It's all in the imagination, creative imagination. And so they say that, the Sufis say, for example, Ibn Arabi says that the divine imagination is delegated to each creature, and we think that we are imagining, whereas in fact it is the divine imagination that is carried further down. Now that is again borne out by what Hazrat Inayat Khan says when he says, he speaks about the personality, and he calls it the greatest art, and the art of personality. And he says that the divine creativity is continued by man. Man's creativity is an extension of the divine creativity. And so a composer might think that he is composing, but in fact he is letting the divine creativity pass through him. It's extending further, and could not have materialized if it were not for his instrumentality, for his offering himself as an instrument. And so you see, creative imagination plays a very important role in Sufism. Now the Sufis distinguish between imagination and fantasy. When the imagination flows from its source, and it's just extended through the human being, and they call it hima, which is one could call it inspiration. And what can happen is that the person ceases to keep aligned, let's say, with the divine consciousness, and then tries to create something out of his own by having broken the link with his original inspiration. And that's fantasy. And so according to the Sufis, when one is attuned with the divine consciousness, then, or rather, yes, all right, well then all that one does is to open oneself to the divine action coming through one, and everything that one is creative of oneself, or rather, the divine creativity can function in one, and as a consequence, one's personality becomes enriched. Whereas if one has cut oneself away from the divine creativity, then the personality remains the way it was. So the secret of progress, of spiritual progress, is of course to know how to link yourself up with the divine creativity that is passing through you. We look upon this problem from another angle, and that is much of what we think is creativity is reaction instead of action. For example, we react to what we saw and think about it or even describe it. There are some artists who simply, I think that's probably what is called the realistic school. It's simply a matter of reproducing what you have experienced through your senses. So that's not real creativity. It's like a photograph, just taking a photograph without, one can be creative in photography too, of course, but just ordinary taking a portrait, taking a photo, a snap. So most of our thoughts accrue to us from outside. Do you realize that? That most of our thoughts are something that we see, conversation that we have, something that we read in a book, and our thoughts carried by that impulse that has been, there was an input into our consciousness from outside. Now, what we call creative imagination is when the thought descends from above and not from, and is not simply a reaction to a thought that accrues to us from outside. Creativity is calling into action possibilities that one had not envisioned before. That's what it is. Discovering resourcefulness is the very essence of creativity. So instead of keeping on doing the thing that one has always done and thinking in terms that one has always thought, one tries out another way. Like, I have this conflict with this person, and one goes on thinking, I think in my terms and he in his, and we're in conflict. And then all of a sudden I think, well, how about if we did it this way? Like, there's a way that we hadn't thought of. Just one example. For example, Einstein, you know what made Einstein is because he was listening to his professors, and he thought to himself, well, is that the only way of looking at that problem? Couldn't one look at it another way? So he was not, he wouldn't just, that's creativity. He was not just accepting the way that they were thinking, and not only the way they were thinking, but he was brought up to thinking because he realized that his mind was being conditioned by them. That's creativity. You know that creativity is irrational. That is, one does not accept to be limited by the norms of rationality. There's something irrational in the human mind which can either be random or represent a higher degree of orderliness than the one that has been brought into operation so far. It's not just doing one's own thing, disregardless of the overall harmony. It's not towing the line to the divine harmony, but it's representing the, how can I say, one could say the nostalgia of the order to beat its own records, to open new horizons, to change, to be dynamic instead of static. And that's inventiveness. So this is that resourcefulness that I'm talking about. If we continue thinking the way we've always thought, we'll never be creative. If we just try to be defiant and unconventional, it's like it could lead to anarchy. Like everybody does his thing without any regard for the other. That's not being creative. So creative thing is to really feel oneself as the representative of the whole. As a matter of fact, that word representative is just the word that we're using now in the Sufi order instead of leaders. And what I am is, I'm not the head, I'm the representative general. And that was a word that was used by Murshid, curiously enough, right back in 1926. And the meaning of it just dawned upon us, like one is representing the order of the universe. Maybe more misrepresenting it than representing it, but still, that's the whole idea, is to feel that one. Well, I'll illustrate this. That's the best way to do it. In one of our very early camps, it was in Colorado. I don't know when that was. That was a long time ago. Maybe it was 62 or something like that. I was quite young then, or relatively young. And I remember that there was a dance teacher there, and we, after, I think it was a Daoshan session, and then we asked the dance teacher if she could just take over and teach us something. So she said, all right, let's form groups, clusters of people. And then she said, okay, there's no leader. That was quite a shock for me. It was very good, actually. and no leader, and we just, in each group, you see, there's no leader, so, and nobody is to take over as leader, so, but people are supposed to move. And of course nobody moved because nobody dared to take on the role of a leader. And then she said, well, you see, the whole idea is to just feel like the dynamics of the group, you see. And then what happened is that we all moved synchronistically because we were embodying the dynamics of the group, see. Nobody was a leader, he was just representing the group. So that's the meaning of the word representing, see. However, the group would never have moved if one person had not at some time taken upon himself to represent the group. That's the only incentive there, was that take over. And he wasn't doing his, or she, he or she weren't doing her thing, but just simply going along with that overall feeling. That's creativity. Like there's an impulse within each one of us to move the order of the universe one step further. For example, you can't compose like Schubert. You have to re-embody the spirit of this time to be creative. And just writing a few notes down on a piece of paper, totally at random, that's not creative either, that's fantasy. So somehow you have to be able to represent the spirit of our time in music, if you're a composer, for example. And they made this serve as a model for our personality, because our personality has to be a work of art, and therefore it has to express something of the new ways of looking upon things, of understanding things in our time. We have to be new people. And many of the spiritual orders are turned towards the past, like there's the model of the guru and there's the model of the masters and so on. Why do we have to be like Abraham was 2,000 years ago? I don't know, much more than that. That's not being creative. Why do we want to mimic someone? We have to find our way of representing the whole course of evolution, each one unique in his way. And so what we want to do is to promote creativity. And what I'm saying is that stress, that same power that can prove destructive to a person, can be used, can be harnessed in a constructive way. But only if, as I say, one calls upon these higher faculties. And what I'm saying ultimately is that instead of allowing the environment to act upon you, you act on the environment. Well, if you go about in streets of New York and you're conscious of the divine power coming through you, you won't be caught up by all those kind of rather ugly and gawky emotions that are around you. And you don't even need to adapt, because you have something to give. It's when one is not creative that one adapts. Creative people don't adapt themselves. In fact, they're quite irascible. Like, look at creative people like Beethoven. I mean, he just wouldn't adapt himself to the society of his time, or Wagner, or any of the great creative people. Einstein, I remember Einstein saying, I organized my life so that I could work to fulfill my purpose. Never allowed the circumstances to affect what he had to give. That is, whenever you come in a place, you bring your world with you. And when I say your world, that means you're conscious of all the levels of your being. And don't let yourself be forced into that apex at the bottom of the pyramid that I was talking about, which is only a fraction of one's being. One gets diminished by the dint of the stress upon one. One gets diminished in one's sense of dignity or one's sense of identity, and so on. There's a stress upon one's sense of identity. And the only way to counter that, either, to escape. Sometimes if you're overstressed, it's better to get out of the situation and strengthen yourself, but then you have to get back into it again. But act upon the environment. As the biologist said, it's true that the species do adapt themselves to the environment, but remember that they also adapt the environment to their own sense of purpose, and that's very important. Sense of purpose instead of causality. You see, causality, you adapt yourself to the circumstances. You are following the causal law. Because of this happened, and so on. That's causality. But purposefulness is exactly the opposite. It's a defiance of the laws of causality. We come to this marvelous definition of the purpose of the seed by Dr. David Bohm, who is, frontier line physicist of our time. He says the seed is an intelligence powered by energy that transforms the environment into serving its own sense of purpose. I'll say that again. The seed is an intelligence. That's the programming of the universe. That's what we are. We are the programming of the universe. That's what we are. Our bodies are the donkeys that is carrying this programming. Fortunately, we have now, the computer has opened up a whole new way of thinking, where now we understand. Before, when we spoke about higher planes and mind, body, some people said, well, it's all the same, mind, body is the same, and what do you mean? But now when we say, well, there's a software and the hardware, people understand. So a seed is not that substance that you have in your hand. No, the seed is a code. In other words, it's a software. So he says it's an intelligence. That's what intelligence is. It's the program. And then he says it's powered by energy. And indeed, I told you that for the crystal to evolve, it had to pick up energy from the environment. And you'll notice that during this seminar, this retreat, we're doing two things. We're working with consciousness, intelligence, and we're working with energy. Those are the two components that make for evolution. There's a third one, but scientists don't go along with that very much, and that's ecstasy. That's the meaning of Satchit Ananda. In fact, ecstasy is the greatest power there is. But I say it takes a lot doing to convince scientists about the resourcefulness of ecstasy and bring about evolution. So, right, it's an intelligence powered with energy that transforms the environment, because what the seed does, for example, is the seed of a plant, for example, it changes the earth into a plant, transforms the earth into a plant, and the water into a plant, and the air into a plant, and the sun into a plant, and even the light of the stars into a plant. So it is organizing the environment. Look at what the DNA does. How does the DNA replicate? It's through the RNA, it's transforming the food into its own substance that is structured according to its own code. So it's transforming the environment in order to pursue its own purpose. And so the important thing is now, what is that purpose? And that purpose is to seek continually better ways of now I'm adding something to what David Bohm said, of manifesting the non-manifest, or actuating reality. And that's what Murshid says by saying, make God a reality. The French use the word existentiate, to existentiate the latency. And that's why Nifari says, why do you look for God up there? He is here. There he is a latency, here is a reality. Well, see, the emphasis here is on the bounty. And I think that is this resourcefulness I'm speaking about, is the bounty. Like in the parable of Christ, when he gave, it was a king, I forget now, the master of the house, who gave the same talent to everyone, but some of them made more use of it. So the bounty is latent within that gift, and what one does with it, well, that's what makes a difference. So this is that resourcefulness that I'm talking about. And some people just don't know how to call upon their resourcefulness. And they go under because the stress is so great. And then it's a total defeat, it's a fiasco. And so I think that what we want to learn is to become aware of that resourcefulness. And what Murshid what Murshid's teachings is really in this sense based upon those of Christ, when he says, be ye perfect as your Father. And what he is saying really is that you all have that resourcefulness in you, that bounty. But now you can only be it if you are aware that you are it. And so the whole of life is a process of self-discovery, exactly as the hidden treasure that desired to be known. Each one of us is experiencing it in our own self. And then the second thing is to have the strength to believe in that bounty. And I think that's the meaning of faith. To believe in the bounty inherent in one's own being, instead of believing in a God up there, believing in the God in one, in the presence of that bounty within one. And that bounty is not something that is just given, it's something that proliferates. And therefore, it's not good enough just to be what you have inherited from your forefathers. You have to be something new. You have to make something out of those talents instead of just being limited by whatever those talents were. That's why they proliferate, you see. Something new is born out of the cross-pollination of the different fractions of the totality. It's like, that there's a new reality in a chord on a piano, for example, than just the addition of the notes. A new reality is formed by the interaction between the notes. It's a new reality. And so in that sense, you are a new reality, in that the bounty that you've inherited presents itself uniquely in you, in each one of us uniquely, although it's the same bounty, but somehow it's presented in a special way. And then through the cross-pollination of what is in you and what is in another, something enormous is won, is gained. And that is this resourcefulness I'm talking about is the immunity. That the genes of the body, of the DNA, are not, as a few years ago people thought, already, let's say, set and unchanged, unalterable throughout the whole of life. Not at all. The genes will alter themselves to form just the right structure to neutralize a virus or germ or a microbe. That's immunity. The body's ability to even alter its structure in order to meet stress. That's immunity. And you see, the thing about immunity is that one can one can increase one's immunity by facing stress as long as one is not overstressed. An example of it is, for example, Buddha, Shiva, who took had himself bitten by a snake every day, but he increased the dose. So what he was doing, he was increasing his immunity against poison gradually. So if you overstress yourself too much to start with, then of course you develop a kind of flight instinct. That is, you flee from the source of your of stress into a state of despondency and despair. It's overstressing. So really speaking, the thing to do then is to reverse that process and to accustom the person to a little stress, and then a little more and a little more, reaccustom the person to a little stress. And of course the person is afraid now of facing any stress at all. So it takes a lot of patience to make the person realize that, well, that was too much stress, but a little stress they can take, a little more. It's exactly like facing fear. Like if a child is afraid of a dog, get him a puppy, and then gradually the puppy grows up, then he learns how to face a bigger dog. Accustom oneself to the thing that one fears, and gradually increase the stress. Now I know that the negativity of the thinking of these people reaches a point that they don't want to try anything more, like they've just given it up. Very difficult to reverse that process when that's taking place. Very, very difficult. And the same thing is true of course, believing in one's resourcefulness. If one is given up believing one has it in one, it's very difficult to believe in it again. You see, that the real answer to this is that to bring about a change in the human being, it takes something very strong and traumatic. And the real answer is that it is the being of the master, I mean, the being of a highly awakened and realized soul that can help another person. However much one understands the problems, one can't help. That's why psychologists have so much difficulty in bringing about a change. I don't say there's no change. So how would a teacher teach a person to compose, or if he's a musician or an artist, for example, how would an artist, teacher of art, teach an artist? Now that's a very good case. So think of yourself as the work of art and also as the artist. And now there's a teacher. So that's what spirituality is, the teacher. What would the teacher do? For example, the artist has made this picture, and the student artist. And the teacher says, well, that's a bit dull. You could bring a little more sort of light in it, and it's so indefinite. You just make it a little more frisky, like a little more positive or something. In fact, you're underplaying something that is in you, but perhaps you're afraid. Perhaps maybe if the teacher was a psychoanalyst, he would say, well, maybe you were beaten up as a child, developed complexes, or you're hiding something like that. And it's true that there are quite a number of factors in our personality that are due to trauma in our childhood, of course, but one can overplay that. That would be
accounting for our personality in terms of causality. And you know that causality is only one of the factors accounting for things. The other is purposefulness instead of causality, and that's things are not only determined by the past, but are determined by the future. There's a biologist, I forget his name now, who said that species do not just adapt themselves to their environment, as the Darwinian theory, but adapt the environment to their own sense of purpose. So it's an anticipation of how their purpose, which determines their morphogenic evolution. And David Bohm once defined the seed as being an intelligence endowed with energy which transforms the universe in order to fulfill its purpose. That's a marvelous definition of the seed. The DNA, that's a seed. An intelligence endowed with energy which transforms the universe or processes the universe in order to pursue its objective. That's future-oriented. That's not past. That's not causality. You see? And so, as Hazrat Inayat Khan says, personality is the fruit on the tree of life. That's what is gained by life. That's the nitty-gritty. That's where it is at. I could say the universe is the womb in which the personality is the template. And the interesting thing here is that, as Hazrat Inayat Khan very well says, he says, of course the human being completes the divine creativity, and in as much as we participate freely and consciously in our creativity, let's say the divine creativity can reach a further stage of perfection that it could not reach if we were not participating in it consciously and intentionally. That's and even the total, let's say, if you like, instead of using the word divine will of the universe is multiple, and the incentive of one person can affect the totality. In fact, the motion of one wave eventually involves the whole sea. That's Max's law of inertia, as you know. Now, anything that you do or say has an influence, whether you like it or not, has an influence on the whole rest of the universe. There's no way in which you can think that you protect people from your actions or thoughts, of course, or a word. I repeat again once more the kind of paradigm that I'm referred to, and that is that creativity is, of course, its inventiveness, of course. And the example that I give is a number of musicians who are improvising. Now, that's creative. And either there's one leader and everybody is towing the line, well, then the one leader is creative and the others are not, or then everyone is participating in that creativity. Now, if everyone were just doing their thing, then of course it would be a cacophony. If everyone was listening to the head, as I said, it would not be creative. So the only way in which it can be creative is for everyone to listen in to the general feeling of the whole, in fact, to listen in to everybody else, and at the same time contribute some measure of free inventiveness to the whole. These are the words of John Sebastian Bach, as some of you may have heard. He says, the art of my science, the science of my art, nobody knows but myself. He said, I'm trying to create a model for a human commonwealth. Just imagine, his music was intended as a model for society, like Plato tried to in the Republic, for example. And he said, for every instrument a theme, for every theme an instrument. And then he went on, not the autocratic imposition of one theme upon the others, as you have in a melody and accompaniment, but every instrument, every voice, we say, restricting its incentive for the purpose of the harmony of the whole, and yet each instrument contributing freely towards the harmony of the whole. If you watch the music of Bach, you find that, well, sometimes there is a theme with accompaniment, like the air and the G string, for example. But if you look at the accompaniment, it's not just chords, there's a second theme and a third theme and so on. So it's polyphony. Sometimes you find that in the music of Bach, for example, chorales, the harmony is all prevailing, so that there's very little room for themes. There's some room, but say there's more accent on the columns, let's say, of chords, the overall harmony. And then you find some works of Bach, for example, so the inventions, of course, and some of the, for example, sonatas for, I know, of course, it's sonata for cello and piano, where the themes don't quite mesh. Sometimes they mesh a little better than others, so he's giving much more freedom to the individuals, while at the same time listening into the overall harmony. So he is showing how creativity can reach a point where one gives a little more incentive to the inventiveness of the parts, while at the same time listening in. But still, a little more than the terrible constraint of having to, having no freedom because one has to listen to everybody else, and there's no way of being creative at all. Now, how does this apply to our lives and our personalities? Well, we have the choice between being very establishment, or then being very new age. And fortunately, a lot of people found a way of striking a nice balance between the two. You see, it's really the balance is really between creative imagination and fantasy. You see, if you just do your own thing, you very easily end up being a freak. If you listen in too much, you become very sclerosed and what they call in France the petit bourgeois. And so balance between the two is, that's where it is. Like, how can you find a new way of being? Because inventiveness is always finding a non-commonplace solution to a problem of yourself, for example. That is, or finding a way of being that is you have not thought of before and nobody else has thought of before. That's creativity. Otherwise one is just part of a pattern. For example, you know, of course, that the thing about Einstein was that he refused any of the commonplace solutions that his predecessors had accepted. Now, I'm sure that some of his predecessors had perhaps for one moment dared to think of the solution that Einstein suggested and must have given it up as being absolutely preposterous. And in fact, some of the views of physicists nowadays are considered as being quite preposterous. In fact, it takes a whole generation before the views of scientists are accepted by the next generation. So creativity, as I said, is finding a way of being which is not like a cliché, is not differs from anything that's been done before. You have to be creative. You have to, each one of you, have to be different from people, from other people. Otherwise, you're part of a pattern. And what is more, to be creative, one has to be even different from the way one was before. That's progress. Otherwise, one gets sclerosed into a personality type. So now you see how this doesn't fit in with many of the rather old-fashioned teachings of some of the spiritual schools, which are based upon trying to imitate a master of the past. or a master, when I say a master of the past, a master as such as we imagine him to have been, him, her, to have been in the past. Like Abraham. Now, if Abraham lived today, he might not have a beard. So we're still thinking of Abraham such as he's been depicted by the artist who probably did capture something of his being at that time. And of course this applies to the Guru-Chela relationship. You find that I think the public is sometimes rather concerned about the fact that pupils tend to model themselves on their teacher instead of being themselves. This is a very tricky question because, of course, you know that we are all seeking for ourselves. Well, when I say seeking for ourselves, what I really mean is that we are seeking for what we could be if we would be what we might be. That is, we have a kind of anticipated view of the possibilities of what we might become. Imagine the bud of a rose having a kind of anticipated vision of what it will be when it becomes a fully grown rose. Now, a child is always thinking about what I'm going to do when I'm grown up, what I'll be like when I'm grown up. And that is creative. You see, a child is, generally the creativity of a child is very beautiful. The creativity is knocked out of the child when he goes to school. She goes to school, and children, of course, shun originality, and therefore the child loses his originality very quickly. It's not done, you know, to do this or to be like this and so on. We're searching for what we could be, and remember that it's not the same thing. You see, what is potentially in us is our inheritance, like be perfect as your father. I would say it's given, but all you have to do is to unfold what is given. That is, of course, the first way of looking at things. But the next way is that you don't have to be as you've inherited. You can find new ways of being. Or at least one could say that we also inherit creativity, and therefore as such we can be different to anything that's been before. Well, we're seeking for ourselves, right? And in order to become what we could be, it is helpful for us to see ourselves in another ourselves who is able to manifest what we are. Of course, one of the most striking examples was that Rishi that I met in the Himalayas once, and I was quite young at the time. And he said, why have you come so far to see what you should be? And of course the answer is that in order to be what I could be, it is helpful to see myself as you. That is, of course, the secret of the Guru-Chela relationship. But that's only the first step. The second step is to find a way of being which is not like one's guru or the person whom one has helped one. So that in that sense the guru is like a step in the ladder. And Hazrat Inayat Khan said that once when he said, it's a period of training, and at the end of the training the pupil has graduated, and neither the teacher is a teacher nor the pupil is a pupil, but they're good friends. That friendship was developing all the time, of course, but that's the very beautiful way of looking at things. And it's a Sufi way as opposed to the guru idea that in India, the Hindu tradition. And even Murshid said that in one swing of his arm, the teacher can lift the pupil beyond his own status, which gives us hope. I had, at some time in my life, I had a cello teacher who really couldn't play the cello, but he was a marvelous teacher. So it's like, do what I say, but don't do what I do. But there, you see, the good teacher is someone who knows how to encourage the creativity of a person. that is, who senses not just the talent that is there, that's given, as I said, but what could be made out of that talent, which is more, that's looking into the future. Creativity is looking into the future. Creativity starts with emotion, and then the creative imagination transduces thoughts into forms, and these forms appear as landscapes of the soul. The reason for that word is that the human mind will always try to formulate in images that resemble familiar images, metaphors which in fact do not have a form, but they are transduced into form by one's creative imagination. And so one has the impression of walking in landscapes, familiar and sometimes unfamiliar. Sometimes it's more like flying in skyscapes than walking in landscapes. One is oneself part of the landscape and discovers a new aspect of oneself through that imaginary form. This is what they call Bravery, which is a state between ordinary day consciousness and dream. It's a very important state because that is the state in which creativity takes place. One is not limited to the forms of the physical universe, nor has one interrupted the iron thread of memory between the physical plane and the plane of imagination. The door is open, and so irrational seed thoughts and emotions are triggering over the threshold on the screen of the mind, and one is able to record what is happening. Rather like the state of dream, one is not able to use one's will, because then one would be right back into ordinary consciousness again. And the consciousness is really rather decentered, rather impersonal, so much so that one really identifies totally with a picture of oneself that one projects before one. And the landscape itself is really, again, a projection of oneself in a form. One is auto-suggesting to oneself visionary type of dream, but it's not quite the same thing, because here one is not dreaming, one is in a state of reverie, one is between the dream and the ordinary consciousness. And secondly, in auto-suggesting a dream, you're doing something with your will first of all, and then afterwards you let an unconscious will take over. Here one is never using one's will. It's always an unconscious will that is piloting one's state of consciousness. In a sense, allows the whole formative process of the universe to work through one, projecting self through forms. And now, if there was absolutely no control of the will, one would open oneself to creativity. Starts, as I say, at the level of emotion, and so it's the type of emotional attunement that is going to set the pace. Majesty and power, divine majesty and power, all those values which are really ultimate and ultimately meaningful to most people, whereas one has personal aspirations that are more tangible, of course, and more human. So that's the only thing you have to do. Now we find that the mantra, that is the use of sound, is perhaps the way of setting the pace. That's why Mahesh Yogi, for example, uses the mantram. He lets people's mind wander, but the mantram is supposed to set the pace. Human voice is not always up to producing very beautiful sounds that are inspiring for meditation. And we have here the sounds of gongs. Hopefully it would be desired if the human being would be able to produce these wonderful sounds. What I would like us to do this morning is to immerse ourselves very deeply into the vibrations of these gongs. The frequencies of each of these gongs has a whole psychic content for us. Each one of us will probably react differently to each sound, but you know that every emotion or seed thought in us has its vibrational counterpart, let's say. It has its frequency. That is the real nama, the real name of all things, the sound, the meaning of, that's the meaning of the symphony of the spheres. And consequently, we understand that language without the mental content of our verbal language. We understand it very deeply. We understand it in our soul. So what I'm hoping to do is that we will be able to use those sounds to help us foster that process whereby the divine many splendid bounty becomes a reality in our personality. We have to project those archetypal qualities. The landscape, as I say, could be rather unreal, the light, diaphanous. It's a kind of transparent scene, multi-dimensional, through which very much more transpires than in our flattened out physical universe, where every nuance of color and form and motion has a deep psychic significance to the soul. That's why we call it landscape of the soul. I'd like you to not just to listen to the gong, that's not good enough, but definitely to start resonating, and that means that one lends oneself to the action of the vibration of the gong and vibrates with it internally, in more ways than one, perhaps in one's psyche also, until one is really permeated with the sound of the gongs. If you can, be aware of the overtones, so one tone triggers off a whole gamut of overtones, and just let your soul be carried beyond your earthly bondage into dimensions very rarely experienced.